We're in verse 6, Romans 5, verse 6 to 11. Last week, Paul shows us the hope that we have in our Lord Jesus Christ. And he shows us the hope that we have in the glory of God. He shows us also the hope that we have even when we suffer. That suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame. Jesus Christ will not shame you. He will not put you to shame. And so in Romans 5, as we look at this text together, we see that hope is played out. Last week, somebody was asking me, okay, I understand the endurance part, I understand the character part, but I'm trying to wrap my mind around the hope part, and it's an honest question, and you can't dodge the question. And so Paul, he's going to answer us in Romans 5, 6 to 11. Let us read together. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would even dare to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since therefore we have been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. Since therefore much more. Paul is painting a picture of progression. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more, now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life. But even more than that, we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have now received reconciliation. Since therefore more, even more, much more than that, Paul is just kind of continuing to, he's hitting on the benefits that you receive through our Lord Jesus Christ. While we were still weak, while we are ungodly, while we are enemies, he's not painting a rosy picture. He's not saying, well, while you started to figure it out, while things became clearer, while you almost had it, while you were good for a little while, Christ died for you. No, he said, while you were still weak, while you were ungodly, while you were still sinners, Jesus died. He did not wait for you to get well. I was listening this week to a man named Paul Tripp. Paul Tripp's a counselor. He does his best work in understanding how parents relate to children. And what he says is this: love does its best work when we don't deserve it. Love does its best work when we don't deserve it. And I love that. Because if I deserve it, if I've earned it, if I've done something that merits God's love, then it's not that hard for him. It's not that difficult. There's no cost. Love does its best work when we aren't deserving of it. And you consider Paul. If you know the story of Paul, he's a man hardened. Before Jesus, he was hardened by anger and hate and murderous threats. Acts 9 tells us. He wouldn't have chosen Jesus. He was too far down the road of anger and hate, and he was convinced that he was the one, as a Jew of Jews, doing God's will. He's convinced of his own righteousness, and then Jesus comes and stops him. Yeah, I was thinking this week, I'm telling you, and you might get tired of me saying this, but the way parents relate to their children is a picture of how we understand the gospel. It is a picture of how much we realize how Jesus relates to us, how much we really know it. And I'm thinking of the way, and you might get tired of me saying this, but this is constant. This is how it works in my house. I'm thinking the way I interact with my sons. And they need me. They need Wendy to guide them, to show them. They can't figure it out all on their own. They need us to show them the way. And many times I find myself reacting to their behavior. I find myself reacting to some of the things they do, how they relate to one another. And I find myself imposing my will upon them. Do this. Do you know what I have done for you? Obey me. Do you know? I mean, that's just like the worst, isn't it? Don't you know what I do for you? Man, I hear that echoing in my mind from my parents and their parents before them, and just carrying on that generational anger. Don't you know? Can't you just do this? I can't believe you did that again. That's a picture of how I understand the gospel. Because Jesus doesn't do that. God doesn't sit there and say, I can't believe you did that again. He doesn't do that. He doesn't sit there and say, don't you know? Don't you know what I've done for you? How much I have given you? He doesn't say that. Brothers and sisters, we cannot continue to hear the gospel in that light. Or I say to my kids, you need to say you're sorry right now. Right now. Like you're going to get a meaningful sorry out of that situation. It's not going to happen. You can't force right thinking. Our children need to see it in action. They need to see it by the way I understand the gospel, by the way you understand the gospel. We need to be re-mentored by Jesus. We have been mentored. All of us have been mentored by people in our lives. Some of that mentoring is very, very good. Some of it is not so good. Some of it is really bad. Like the way I grew up thinking about how you talk to people when you're not happy. Or the way you grow up thinking about how you view women or how you view men because of what you've seen in your house, what you've seen in your neighbor's house, what you've seen when you go to work. And we need to be re-mentored by Jesus. And consider how he comes to us. We can't help ourselves to him. He comes to us. We are weak. He comes to us. We are ungodly. He comes to us. We are enemies. He comes to us. We can't help ourselves to God. We don't choose to follow him and do what is right, and he doesn't wait for that. He doesn't wait for us to kind of get it right. It's his initiative. It's his move. And every other move thereafter. It's not ours. You see, because without him, we are on the road to anger and hate and wrath and racism. However subtle that might be. my friend from Tennessee, he is very aware of his racism. He's very aware that his father uses the N-word on a regular basis. And he's very aware of that. It's something that he has to regularly bring to Jesus. He's raised in that environment. And he said this, and I believe this is true because this is how I grew up. In the South, they are very, very aware of racism and the role that that has played in their history. And he told me, he said, you guys in the North are not aware, and yet it's there. It's there, however subtle that might be. And he's right. Without Jesus, that's our path. We're unable, we're enemies, we are without hope, and hope comes. Here's where the hope comes. My friend asked me last week, how does the hope come? Here's where the hope comes. Our hope is in the love of Christ. Our hope is found in God's love through Christ for the weak, for the ungodly enemies. If you look at the text again, it says, for while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. At the right time, Jesus' time has been fulfilled. He dies for the ungodly. It was time for him to walk the lonely road to the cross. He's mocked. He's spit upon. And this is by religious people. He's mocked. He's spit upon. He walks that lonely road. He's deserted by his friends, the ones that called him friend, the ones that called him brother, the ones that called him Lord. He is deserted by them. And he goes and he dies for these, the ones who spit upon him, the ones who mocked him. These same ones who carried out this anger and this hatred are the ones who deliver him up to be crucified. Same ones who mocked and spit upon him, the ones who deserted him. They would be the ones who he would restore. They would be the ones who believe. They would be the ones who build his church to be his witnesses. I want to look at verse 7 just briefly. For one will scarcely die. So verse 6, let's back up. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. While we were still weak, while we were ungodly, while we were enemies. In verse 7, it says, for one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one might even dare to die. What does that even mean? Jesus does not come to die for people who are righteous. If we were all righteous and good, if we had it figured out, if we did everything the way that it was supposed to be done, there would be no need for Jesus to die. We would scarcely need Christ's life, love, death, and resurrection if we fell in these categories of righteous and good. If we had it all figured out, Jesus' death would be most unnecessary. In fact, that'd be really sad. As a matter of fact, Jesus comes, and we're all righteous, and we're good, and we got to figure out we're treating each other the way we're supposed to, and there's no racism, there's no ugliness, there's no looking at women with ill intent, there's no divorce, there's no wreckage in homes, there's no sickness, there's no pain, there's no tears, and Jesus comes and he walks with us, and he's just a good example, and then he dies. That's a bad story. That's a really bad story. One will scarcely die for a righteous person, though for a good person, someone might dare to die. Jesus doesn't come to die for righteous people. If we were able to help ourselves, we would be sufficient. Paul tells us that this is not the case. He leads with, while you were still weak, while you were ungodly, while you were enemies, Christ died for you. Jesus himself says he does not come to die. He does not come for the righteous, but he comes for sinners. He doesn't come for the ones who are healthy. He comes for those who are sick. God's love works on a completely different dimension than our own. God's love works on a completely different level than our own. You know, I might lay my life down for a friend of mine. I might do that. I would love to think that I would certainly lay my life down for my family. And I'm sure many of you would say the same thing. We would lay our lives down for our kids. We would lay our lives down for our spouses, our loved ones. I might do that. But I'm not gonna go out of my way for somebody who's a liar and a cheat and a stealer, somebody who has harmed me. I'm probably not going to go out of my way for that kind of person. I'm just not. And if we're honest with ourselves, we would all probably be saying the same thing. I'm not going to go out of my way for that. God's love works on a different level than ours. He's in a completely different dimension. Jesus doesn't distinguish. He lays his life down for his enemies. Jesus doesn't distinguish. He lays his life down for the weak and the ungodly, for people who spit at him and mock him and flog him and desert him. That's who he lays his life down for. For rebels. For people who need to be realigned, re-mentored, reoriented to sanity. He's the one who, in washing his disciples' feet, he's sitting down and he's showing them love by washing their feet. He's washing the feet of one who will certainly betray him and deliver him up to be crucified. It's the victim. My friend points this out to me. It's the victim who washes the feet. That's a different level of love. He washes the feet of those who betray him and desert him. We'll go back to that quote at the beginning. Love does its best work when we don't deserve it. Love does its best work when we don't deserve it because it's really love. And that's where the hope is. We're about to go before the Lord's table. The Lord lays out a table for us. He shares a meal with the disciples who will abandon him, who will desert him. One will betray him. One will kiss him on the cheek and deliver him up to be crucified. And he shares the meal with them. And he shares that meal with you. And he doesn't wait for us to get it all right. He doesn't wait for us to have it kind of figured out for half a day or for half a minute, as it were. He shares this meal with us and calls us into his presence when we are weak and when we are ungodly and when in fact we would rather run from God because honestly, in our minds, it seems easier. He shares this bread and this cup. I'm going to call our